Okay, it's great to be with you again today. Today we're going to talk about how to build intimacy through physical touch. And I'm excited to get into this. You'll remember from our last video, we talked a little bit about this principle called the handholding assessment and how you can use that in marriage. And today I'm going to share with you a little bit more why something like that is so effective, the principles that it's tapping into that helps build your relationship to a stronger place. So stay tuned. All right, building intimacy with physical touch. So let's begin this video quickly by reviewing what is intimacy. When we refer to intimacy, what do we mean by intimacy? So I want to use as a definition for intimacy anything that helps build connection and attachment and fulfillment in your relationship is intimacy. So intimacy is a word that we're just going to use to define connection, strength, and fulfillment in a relationship, right? That connection promoting thing. Intimacy, right? And typically there's two major tracks for forming intimacy in relationships. One is an emotional track, building emotional intimacy, emotional connection, emotional attachment. And one is physical intimacy, building physical connection, attachment, fulfillment, physical intimacy, right? And in our last video, like I referenced, we talked about this hand-holding assessment. This idea that during a conflict, you can assess whether or not you're in a place to effectively resolve and work through that conflict by asking yourself, could I hold my partner's hand in this moment? Right? It can help you assess where your perception is, right? How you're seeing things with your partner and whether or not you're in a mind state that can be effective and helpful in conflict resolution, or whether some reframe is needed. And the reason that this hand-holding assessment is so helpful is because it plays into the physical intimacy of a relationship. Right? Holding hands is something that we don't do with a stranger typically. And if we do, it's with great discomfort. It would feel very awkward, right? And the reasons are because I don't feel an emotional connection or attachment to that stranger, right? And I may not even want one with that stranger. And the same is in our marriage. It can be helpful because holding hands is a reflection of the intimacy level in a relationship. So let's begin then by defining the various levels of physical intimacy that can be exchanged in a relationship. And we'll begin with brief touch. So brief touch is something that we typically do in relationships that requires very little vulnerability. And because there's a one-to-one correlation between vulnerability and intimacy potential, it also carries with it very little intimacy. Right? But brief touch, one of the most common ways in which you see this play out in a relationship is two individuals when they're greeting one another, giving each other a handshake or giving somebody a high five, right? Or touching somebody on the shoulder, right? That's a brief touch. So it's something that doesn't require a lot of intimacy in the relationship to do. And it doesn't require a lot of vulnerability to do. It's something that we can comfortably do with people that we're not that connected to. If we were to take that up in intimacy, if we were going to notch it up a little bit, the next notch up from brief touch would be like a supportive touch. So a supportive touch is something that we might do in a relationship that requires a little bit more vulnerability, right? So an example of a supportive touch is holding somebody's arm or touching somebody's elbow while you're listening to them. It's kind of a prolonged brief touch, and it's meant to communicate support and connection, right? There's lots of different examples of how it can exist. But it's just prolonging that brief touch. And if we were to notch that up in vulnerability one more time, we would have connective touch. And a good example of connective touch is something like holding hands, right? So it's this prolonged support touch that we're doing with another individual that communicates connection with them. And holding hands is something that couples do frequently that's a good example of this connective touch. So it's meant to build connection, and it's meant to be prolonged for that purpose in building connection. And this is where our hand-holding assessment came in our last video, right? What it's doing is it's bringing this mild to moderate level of physical intimacy into the relationship through an assessment, right? It's asking you in a moment to assess, could I do this mild to moderate level physical connecting with my partner, this connective touch of hand-holding? Could I do this with my partner right now in the midst of our conflict? And if the answer is yes, it probably means that you're in a frame of reference or a mind state, right? That you're operating through an inherent lens, I call it, right? That you're operating in this mind state enough that allows you to see your partner, as your best friend, your lover, your companion, somebody who cares for you, somebody who you care for. It allows you to be in that mind state to resolve this conflict. And the reason that the hand-holding assessment is helpful in that way is because it requires mild to moderate level physical intimacy, right? It's something that we don't do in relationships that we don't feel close and connected to. And it's because that act, that physical act, is an intimate act. It's a mild to moderate level physical intimate display. And it requires a certain amount of vulnerability to pull off, right? So that's why that's so effective. Now, if we were to ratchet up past a connective touch, the next kind of bar up in vulnerability and connection is a nurturing touch. And a nurturing touch is something like a back rub. It's a touch that's meant to nurture another person. It's pretty common. If we have a child that's running and they trip and fall, we might go over and look at their owie. And when we look at their owie, right, we might rub that owie and be like, oh, I'm so sorry. We might even kiss that little owie, right? And with our partner, it's the same type of thing. It's a nurturing touch that we'll do in the relationship that's just meant to physically nurture our partner. And in that touch, in that nurturing touch, like a back massage, shoulder massage, right? If I'm doing a tickling of the arm, right? In that touch, I'm communicating love. And it's more vulnerable than even a connective touch, right? Like it's meant to actively nurture my connection with my partner. If we ratchet up again from nurturing touch, then we have holding and cuddling. And again, with each of these layers, right, as we're holding and cuddling in a relationship, the vulnerability of that physical intimacy increases. And because the vulnerability increases, so does the intimacy increase, right? Because there's a one-to-one correlation between vulnerability and intimacy potential. So that increases with holding and cuddling. You'll notice as we go down through this list as well, there's less and less people likely in your life that you might share this type of intimacy with. Because again, by nature, we typically reserve the most intimate displays of emotional and physical connection to the people that matter the most to us, right? And certainly our partner, we want the spouse to be the number one person. We want them to be the person that you turn to for the most vulnerable and the most connective forms of emotional and physical intimacy. So next, from holding and cuddling, is romantic touch. And romantic touch is taking the nurturing touch and it's adding to it a communication of energy and chemistry, right? And it's trying to communicate to my partner, not only am I connected to you, but some levels of desire for you. It starts to be what makes our relationship unique to other relationships in the world, in that I have romantic love for you, in addition to caring and supporting type love for you. So things that I might do that communicates to my partner that I feel love for you, strong chemistry for you, physically in our relationship. Next up from that is sexual touch, and then we go to sexual acts, and then we get into sexual intercourse, right? So, and as you can see with each of these levels, as we progress into these levels, more and more vulnerability and more intimacy potential, and meant to be intimacy potential reserved for that person that is my person in my world. And we'll do another video that talks specifically about the sexuality in the relationship and how sexuality is a climactic experience of physical intimacy. But for purposes of this video, I just wanted to give you an idea of this continuum in physical intimacy and where this hand-holding exercise and assessment falls into that and why it's so effective, right? That in relationships where we feel connection, where we feel intimacy, there's a certain amount of vulnerability that needs to drive that intimacy. And when we're missing that ability to be vulnerable, so are we missing that intimacy potential. And conflicts is a time that we typically disengage the connection in our relationship. The conflict has created a crisis in the connection. And as a result of that, the intimacy can drop quite quickly. And so does my physical displays of intimacy. My emotional willingness, ability to be vulnerable, can sometimes drop out during conflict as well. And it's why couples will start to communicate in defensive and critical ways instead of vulnerable ways, right? It's because the intimacy in their relationship is lacking during that conflict. It's also why it's hard to be physically intimate with each other in the forms of holding or cuddling or hand holding or connective touch, supportive touch, even brief touch in a relationship can be kind of hard to do in the middle of a conflict. And it's because those types of actions, those intimate actions and displays, emotional and physical, require a certain amount of vulnerability to pull off comfortably. So I hope that's helpful to you in learning a little bit about. If you're really enjoying this topic and you want to deep dive into it, take a look at our Maintaining Intimacy in Sex, Part 1 and Part 2. So our Part 1 video course goes over emotional intimacy and dives really deep into the emotional intimacy of your relationship. There's even some assessments that go with that, some worksheets, activity sheets that you can use to build emotional intimacy and assess where your emotional intimacy is at with your partner. And then the Part 2 of Maintaining Intimacy in Sex is all about the physical intimacy. And it has the same thing, some activity sheets, some assessments that you can use to kind of assess where is the physical intimacy in our relationship, and deep dives into the sexuality of the relationship as well. So I'd highly recommend you take a look at both of those. In the comments below, let us know where you're at in your vulnerability in your relationship, right? How easy it is to be vulnerable with one another, and some things that you've noticed disrupt the vulnerability in your connection. As always, if you know anybody that could benefit from our videos, please share this with them. And please support our channel by liking and subscribing, following our content. Our hope is to create meaningful, helpful, important information and videos that we can send out to individuals around the world to help improve relationships everywhere. We're on a mission to strengthen couples everywhere, and we're grateful for all the support you give us. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking with you again soon.